Welcome back to part 3 of my family historian's interpretation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In this series I'm working on the principle that the novel would have been set between the late summer and autumn of 1811 and the autumn or winter of 1812. And for one particular character, that would have been quite an interesting point in time, their career and in the history of the organisation that they were involved in. I am of course talking about the Reverend William Collins. Mr. Collins is ordained in the Easter of year 1, 1811, before he visits the Bennets in the November. And although chapter 15 describes Mr. Collins' father as an illiterate miser, he must have seen some value in educating his son. Young Mr. Collins, we are told, attended one of the universities. Although there are many universities and affiliated colleges in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland today, in the early 1800s there were far fewer institutions catering for higher education. Probably Mr. Collins is supposed to have attended one of these. University education and life as a clergyman, writing sermons and maybe keeping parish registers, unless he delegates that to a clerk, which is entirely possible, implies that Mr. Collins could read and write. And in 1812, at exactly the time when Pride and Prejudice was set, something quite major happened in terms of parish records, which influences the way that we can research English and Welsh family history even today. An Act for the better regulating and preserving parish and other registers of births, baptisms, marriages and burials in England, to give it its long title, came into force on the 1st of January 1813, and this Act, known as Rose's Act, after the man who introduced it, introduced a standardised, pre-printed parish register that all Anglican churches could use. It's basically a blank book with pages and pages of forms in, all bound, you don't take them out, with spaces for the baptism date, the child's name, the parent's name, place of residence, and the father's occupation. Sometimes it might be the mother's if the child is illegitimate. Given that Wickham and Lydia theoretically marry in August 1812, with Darcy, Elizabeth, Bingley and Jane following at some point before Christmas 1812, and the hint at the end of the novel that Mr. Collins and his wife Charlotte are expecting their first child by that time, there is a good chance that every one of the children born to those couples would have had their baptisms recorded in the new style registers. It's a strange coincidence, but it's really interesting to think about. Now, on the day that he arrives at Longbourn, Mr. Collins is invited to read aloud to the family, and he chooses as his material Fordyce's sermons, to the great horror of Lydia Bennet, who isn't even subtle about the fact that she finds it boring in chapter 14. Mr. Collins takes the hint and he doesn't continue, although he does comment in general terms that Fordyce's intended audience was female, with the implication that Lydia should shut up and listen to something that might do her some good. And I think that the book he's referring to must be Sermons to Young Women. It's a 2-volume work written by a Scottish clergyman that became a fixture in libraries in many private homes, so probably either Mr. Bennet or his father maybe even had bought a copy of the book. So Lydia likes fun and shopping and flirting with officers and all the things she's not supposed to be doing, so maybe it's not surprising that she automatically assumes that a book, for a start, will be boring, and of course a book that is even older than her own mother has got to be boring. But actually, Lydia really could have done with reading a bit of Fordyce. Maybe she should have paid a bit more attention. The sermons cover topics that are of particular interest to the upbringing of young women and their ability to conduct themselves in respectable ways. Virtue, dressing modestly, piety, good works, meekness, all the qualities that society at this time would expect a well-bred, respectable young woman to exhibit, and frankly, which Mr. and Mrs. Bennet should have encouraged in all of their daughters. Not just Mary seems to be the one who's most interested in Fordyce, but this is the kind of qualities that they should have automatically known to instill in their daughters if they wanted them to be respectable. Jane Austen, however, does not suggest that Lydia exhibit any of these virtues. We get to see another side to Mr. Collins' life a little later in the novel when he's married to Charlotte Lucas, and because Charlotte is Elizabeth's close friend, Elizabeth goes to visit them in Kent. Mr. Collins does not actually have a library as such at Hunsford Parsonage where he lives. This is probably actually not all that surprising, because if indeed his father was an illiterate miser, he either had no reason to buy books because he couldn't read, and if he didn't like to spend money, that's another good reason not to be spending good money on books. We are told that Mr. Collins himself spends most of his day either at work in the garden or in reading and writing and looking out of the window in his own book room. Book room is an interesting word. Now, Mr. Collins is somebody with great delusions of grandeur. So although Mr. Collins has only been living at Hunsford for about a year by the time Elizabeth visits, and in fact he's only been ordained for around about a year, he certainly aspires to have a library of his own. So I wonder if the book room is in fact just a kind of starter library. I mean, maybe it's got as few as a dozen books in. It's not a library by the standards of a public library as we think of it today, but it would be the start of a personal library, a personal collection. And that leads us nicely on to Mr. Bingley. When Lizzie visits Netherfield because Jane is ill, because she's been sent to have dinner with Bingley's sisters on horseback in the rain, Bingley offers to bring her some books from his library. He admits that although his collection is reasonable, it is not extensive, because he is not an avid reader, he's not somebody who really buys many books. And his sister does acknowledge that their father's legacy included so small a collection of books. So his father either didn't have the means or didn't have the inclination to begin a library of his own. Caroline, his sister, then compares it, trying to get in Darcy good books, by saying that Darcy's own library at Pemberley is much more impressive. She puts this down to the fact that he is always buying books. Darcy then makes the very wise observation that it's not all his own work. He says that it ought to be good. It has been the work of many generations, so he's just another one in a long line of people buying books to augment the family library, which sort of implies that for at least a century the Darcy family have been both literate and wealthy enough to invest in their collection of books at home. So if we assume that maybe that had been going on for 6 to 8 generations, that maybe takes you back 200 or so years, we're theoretically into Shakespeare's last years of life here. It's not impossible that they might have had some early editions of Shakespeare which would be worth a fortune today. Maybe they had Samuel Johnson's famous dictionary published in 1755. Or they could have any number of what we would consider to be literary classics today. There's Wordsworth and Henry Fielding and Christopher Marlowe and incalculable numbers of other famous books as we view them today. And it's actually really strange to think that in 1811, if that is when the book is set, our characters are just slightly closer to the year 1623, when Shakespeare's first folio was published after his death, than they are to this current year of 2021. That's really, really strange. But during this same conversation, Darcy also makes an interesting comment. He says, "I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these." So what exactly does that mean? Now, although as a wealthy man he could spend his money on other entertainment, maybe we should infer that he prefers to buy the latest books to increase the choice available to his family and guests. He is able to afford it, so he's going to expand his collection and enhance it for the benefit of future generations. It's something he can pass down to his children and grandchildren. He might also be saying, and this is more pertinent in a family history kind of context, that he is aware, proud as he is at this point, or appears to be, he does maybe have some sort of awareness that he is very fortunate to be able to put food on his table and buy books. He's not having to make a choice between the two purchases. However, given his general attitude and the fact that we have yet to fully understand his character at this point in time, that's probably less likely, I would say. It begs the question, what might Darcy have had in his library? He would have been born in the early 1780s, I think, so again, what would his father have been buying to add to the library? It's a work in progress, as any good family library would be. Between 1790 and 1815, we've got the poets William Blake and William Wordsworth, the clergyman and economist Thomas Malthus, who was really interested in the connection between better food production and the growth of population. So the more food you have, the bigger families get, because they can afford to grow up and be better nourished and have more healthy children in future generations. We've got the landscape gardener, designer Humphrey Repton, the very interesting Elizabeth Helm, who was a novelist turned travel guide translator, who later branched out into histories of England, Scotland and Rome, a person I'd never even heard of until I started researching this video. So they were just 4 people that were getting their work into print at this time in history, and as you can see, that's quite a wide variety of subjects just by picking 4 names there. And a few years later, little more famously, Percy Shelley begins writing poetry. His wife Mary publishes her novel Frankenstein. So this is quite an exciting point in English literature. Maybe Darcy is aware of that to some level, and because all these groundbreaking new exciting titles are coming out, maybe he wants to get the first edition of those books, because he understands the value of a first edition, to put in his library so that it will really be worth something in 100 or 200 years time for the general benefit of his family. So, having just heard Caroline Bingley make the groundless accusation that Elizabeth, who is quietly minding her own business, enjoying one of Mr. Bingley's books, being a great reader who has no pleasure in anything else, and then she shows off a bit by laying out her ideas of what sort of skills a socially accomplished woman should have if she is to be considered truly accomplished in a high society kind of way. And Darcy very quickly comments that she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. So it's an indirect compliment to exactly what Elizabeth's been doing in this scene. I have a feeling that once Darcy and Elizabeth were married, I'm almost certain she would have had free access to his very impressive library at Pemberley, and maybe she would have added her own choices to the collection. Of course, as the children were born, maybe there were even brand new children's titles getting their way into the nursery and later into the library. All that is quite interesting to think about, because theoretically, although these are fictional characters, there's no reason it couldn't have happened. Marketing books in the 18th and 19th century would have been very different to the way it is today. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have PR campaigns, they didn't have expensive book launches and TV interviews to help them sell copies of the latest work. But they did have newspapers. And newspapers of the time very often carried notices saying that a particular book was being published on the very same day that this particular newspaper was being published. It was that instant, and then you would know to go out and see your friendly local bookseller and try and get yourself a copy ordered if you really wanted one. And these adverts included some weird and wonderful useful details that you might not expect to find today. You would get details like the price, you might even get a reference to how many volumes the book was published in. I think the original version of Pride and Prejudice was actually a 3-volume edition. That is quite typical of its time. It might also tell you whether it was bound in a particular kind of cover. It might be leather, it might be paper, it might be cloth. It might even tell you whether there were illustrations. The newspapers in the early 1800s did not have pictures. It was down to that advert to really sell that book. For all we know, when Darcy calls into Hunsford Parsonage and he finds Elizabeth there alone, and he took a newspaper from the table to pass the time when the conversation just wasn't flowing, maybe what he was actually doing was having a quick browse just to see whether there were any new books being advertised that he might want to add to that library at Pemberley that his family had been working on for generations. Of course, there were other references to newspapers in the novel as well. One more typical purpose for newspapers is your birth, marriage and death announcements, of great value to any keen genealogist, especially before 1837 when birth, marriage and death certificates came in. Mrs. Bennet is eager to tell the returning Mr. Bingley that her daughter Lydia is married, but she is a bit unhappy with one particular element of all the elements, considering the fiasco surrounding Lydia's wedding. What's she upset about? The way it's been announced in the newspapers. To be very specific, she mentions the Times and the Courier. The Times has got to be the Times, I think. The Courier, there were a lot of different local, regional papers that were the something or other Courier. It could have been any of them. She is quite right in saying that lately George Wickham Esquire to Miss Lydia Bennet is a poor announcement. As a family historian, I would agree. I would call it next to useless. There is no date. You would struggle to match that to a parish record, particularly because there's no mention of the church where it took place in. She thinks her brother, Mr. Gardiner, has made an awful job of wording it. So maybe we should look at what kind of thing Mrs. Bennet was actually expecting to read in the papers. There's quite an interesting comparative example from my own ancestors here. On the 16th instant means the same month, so it's the 16th of May, at Up Holland, Mr. James Worsley of Lowton, fustian manufacturer, to Miss Morris, daughter of Mr. William Morris of the former place. That's quite a good one. It's not perfect, but it's conventional. You've got the date and the village where the marriage took place. You can work out the church from there. You've got the name, the address and the occupation of the bridegroom. You've got the name and address of the bride's father. But notice, the bride was just called Miss Morris. If you know anything about the naming conventions in Pride and Prejudice, that might be a little clue as to why. Because as the eldest daughter in the family, Jane is generally referred to as Miss Bennet because she's the senior Miss Bennet. Her sisters are identified as Miss Elizabeth Bennet, Miss Mary Bennet, etc. But Jane, being the eldest, the most senior sister, doesn't need a clarification. Everybody knows that Miss Bennet is the eldest child of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. And the same would have been true of my ancestor Anne Morris. Actually, she was the only daughter in her family, so when she's described as the daughter of Mr. William Morris of Up Holland, everybody who could recognise her from that announcement would know who the newspaper was talking about. But perhaps what Mrs. Bennet does not grasp is that Mr. Gardiner has been deliberately vague with Lydia's marriage announcement, because Lydia has got married in dubious circumstances and her uncle does not want people to realise that the bride is the same Lydia Bennet as the flirty, unmanageable 15-year-old from Longbourn in Hertfordshire, who has married the same George Wickham who seduced half the girls in Meryton and ran up debts with the shopkeepers and then disappeared off to Brighton. Mr. Gardiner at least, thankfully, has the sense to try to make things look a bit more respectable, which was massively important then. Generally speaking, many of the characters in Pride and Prejudice seem to be literate. Besides Darcy and Mr. Collins, Jane, Elizabeth, Kitty, Lydia Bennet, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Colonel Forster and his wife, Charlotte Lucas, later Collins, Mr. Bennet, Caroline Bingley, Georgiana Darcy, are all noted to send or receive letters at some point. Most notably, when Lady Catherine de Bourgh learns that her nephew Darcy is going to marry Elizabeth Bennet, she sends him a letter containing language so very abusive that it implied that he's willing to stop contacting her altogether, and why not indeed? Caroline Bingley even goes so far when she's trying to curry favour with Darcy as to praise his very neat writing, and she compares it very favourably to her brother's own correspondence. She complains that Charles, her brother, writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half of his words and blots the rest. I can understand how he would end up blotting it with a dip pen or ink in general. In my own family, even a yeoman farmer like my 7 times great-granddad George Hurst was able to leave books in his will. Most specifically, my Old Testament and 2 Bibles to his son Joseph when he died in 1772. And 46 years later, we know from Joseph's own will that he had amassed an even bigger collection of books. All my books I given to my son George and my daughter Mary, his nip. Now, interestingly, Joseph actually died in 1819, which is 6 years after Pride and Prejudice was published. I don't know whether he was into novel reading. Maybe he had a copy, maybe one of his children had a copy. It's something I will have to wonder about there. How many books specifically Joseph had is not stated, so that is anybody's guess, but books means more than one. But clearly some were treasured possessions, and he valued them enough to want to bequeath them to his own children. And I imagine that Darcy probably felt very much the same about the books in his own library. He would consider that an inheritance possibly as valuable as Pemberley itself. So have you got any thoughts about the literacy or writing skills or anything related to that comes up in Pride and Prejudice? Have you spotted something that I haven't? If you have, I would love to hear from you. And in the next part of this series, the final part, I'm going to be looking more into Darcy himself actually. We're going to have a little exploration of his family tree, but that will be coming up in due course. In the meantime, thanks for listening.